What's good? It's Woog. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. We've got Tony Ferguson, 25-4, versus Charles Oliveira, 29-8, with one no contest, in a highly ranked contenders battle in the lightweight division. Ferguson and Oliveira are the number 3 and number 7 ranked contenders, respectively. Oliveira was just ranked number 6 until RDA's recent win over Paul Felder allowed him to leapfrog Oliveira in the rankings. Now, Tony Ferguson, almost overnight, went from being the boogeyman of the division on a 12-fight win streak, interim champ, formerly, kind of a people's champ to many, to now facing close to a must-win scenario against Charles Oliveira. And most of this has to do with Ferguson's age, coupled with that long, brutal 5th-round TKO loss versus Justin Gaethje back in May, one of the biggest and most significant UFC fights of the year. Ferguson, kind of an Iron Man freak of nature, is now 36 years old. And although most weren't really factoring this in heavily prior to that Gaethje fight, now it almost feels unavoidable to look at. I think we were spoiled by Ferguson's success in his early to mid-30s after his devastating knee injury that ruined the 3rd or 4th attempt at a Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Tony Ferguson showdown. Tore the knee like 1 to 2 weeks before the fight. That was heartbreaking. But it obviously wouldn't be the last time that this fight, was anticipated, scheduled, and then canceled. But I do think that this was the most significant and devastating of the Khabib versus Ferguson attempts and cancellations. By the time the most recent cancellation happened, we were just getting into the heavy part of the COVID shutdowns, and it almost became a foregone conclusion. Like, yeah, you know, they're eventually going to cancel Khabib versus Tony. Just unbelievable. But yeah, the time before that was totally crushing. Freak accident, bad knee injury to Tony Ferguson, who then, like some superhero, recovers within months, less than a calendar year, and then returns to beat Anthony Showtime Pettis, and then Donald Cowboy Cerrone 9 months later. Truly amazing for Tony Ferguson. But then, when you look at those two opponents, you had Showtime Pettis, who was almost 4 years removed from his heyday as lightweight champ, and who lost 5 of his last 8 fights leading up into that fight with Tony, who was coming off that devastating knee injury. So Tony beat Pettis and then fought Cerrone, who, in fairness, was on a 3-fight win streak, including one over Al Iaquinta, but who was also pretty long in the tooth himself. So Tony beats Cowboy in a fight where Cowboy blew through his nose, which puffed up his eyes so badly that the fight was stopped. And by the way, Cowboy would go on to lose his next 3 fights following that loss to Tony, but those losses came against like Justin Gaethje, Conor McGregor, and Showtime Pettis. You want to talk about a rough schedule. But the point being, I don't think Tony was ever truly the same fighter and athlete after that bad knee injury, although he was still having success. Because if you go back to his pre-injury fights versus Kevin Lee, Edson Barboza, and especially the one against RDA, which I believe to be the best performance of Ferguson's career, the Barboza one probably being the second. But if you look at these, you could see the difference in Ferguson's defensive reflexes and the speed of his movement. He covers ground in a quicker, more athletic way. Whereas after the injury, I think Tony slightly became more of a bite down on the mouthpiece and come forward and bang kind of guy. Still had creative attacks, but I don't think he was as defensively responsible or reactive. Still effective, but I thought that some of the youthful athletic movement was gone. Then came Tony Ferguson versus Justin Gaethje, which was postponed for a couple months due to COVID, but rescheduled. Tony Ferguson, for some reason, decided to continue with his weight cut for the date of the first scheduled fight, although it had been canceled. That was perhaps unnecessary, and some advised against it around that time. I don't know whether that actually played into Tony's performance. Although it was kind of on brand in Tony's weirdish nature, it's usually not advised to do 2 dramatic weight cuts within like a month and a half of each other. Especially not at 36 years old. And not that Tony's performance was necessarily bad, I just think Justin had the stand-up skills necessary to expose the gradual flaws in Tony's game at that point of his career. In my Ferguson Gaethje video breakdown, I actually picked Gaethje to win the fight, although he was the underdog, because Tony seemed increasingly easy to hit in recent years. I understood why Tony would still be considered the betting favorite. I mean, he was on a roll, and many thought that he was the best in the division, and had thought that for the last few years. But this felt like a bad matchup at the wrong time. And Justin Gaethje looked spectacular in one of the most painful to watch fights of the COVID era. Brutally beautiful performance from Justin. And now I'm left to wonder how much Ferguson has left, especially at 36, and especially after that beating at the hands of Gaethje. Plus, he's now facing Charles Oliveira, who's on a 7-fight win streak. 5 of those 7 wins won Performance of the Night, and Charles Oliveira also holds the UFC record for most submission wins. This dude's a bad boy, and fighters are often in the danger zone whenever they're on the ground with him. Charles Oliveira had been campaigning at featherweight 145, one division below, from 2012 to 2016. Very mixed results. He lost several fights, getting stopped by Cub Swanson, Anthony Pettis, Ricardo Lamas. He also missed weight a bunch of times, so a lot of his fights at featherweight 145 were fought at catchweights. He finally went back to 155 lightweight in 2017, and since then, his only loss was to Paul Felder, who survived a few close submission scares on the ground and then ended up tiring Oliveira out, getting on top of him, and then wrecking him with elbows. That's still one of Paul Felder's best wins, and that's Oliveira's last loss. So Oliveira is catching Tony Ferguson at the best of times for Oliveira and probably the worst of times for Tony Ferguson. Oliveira, once one of the hottest young Brazilian prospects way back in 2010, hit one of those early to mid-career rough patches, but has rounded his game out very nicely in recent years to where his stand-up game, strikes, and knockout ability are almost as scary as his expert Brazilian jiu-jitsu and submission game. He has a third-degree BJJ black belt, and as I mentioned, now has more submissions than anyone in UFC history. But because he's such a freaky athlete, he's really knocking some guys out these days. He's very long-limbed, given his weight. He's quick, agile, and pretty daring. He'll take some risks, kind of like a young Tony Ferguson in that regard. I think Oliveira will be a major factor at lightweight for at least another couple of years. However, I look at the guys Oliveira's beaten during this recent stretch. Jim Miller, Clay Guida, Nick Lenz, even Kevin Lee. These are guys who are either way past their prime, like Miller and Guida, are a couple tiers below elite, like Nick Lenz, or in the case of Kevin Lee, very talented, but have some serious holes in their game. But still, in the UFC, a win's a win, and stringing those wins along to build a consecutive win streak, that's not easy. The problem that I think Oliveira will face in this Tony Ferguson fight is that I think that there's a physical strength gap. I saw the way Oliveira gassed late in the first round versus Paul Felder, then even more so in the second round, to where Felder was kind of able to manhandle him and turn it around and outwork him and get on top and then rain down with those elbows. Tony Ferguson is extremely durable. He's been through the 5-rounders. He's gone deep and late into fights. And with the exception of that Gaethje fight, it's always Tony who's coming on stronger as the fight progresses. At least in recent memory, the past 8 years or so. I think that Tony will ultimate warrior. But I think that Tony will ultimately still have enough in this case to 1, avoid Oliveira's tricky submissions, and 2, avoid getting hurt so badly in the stand-up that it leads to a stoppage. I can picture Tony getting hit and rocked at some point, even before the Gaethje fight. Tony had been hurt versus Showtime. He'd been boxed up a little bit early in the Cowboy Cerrone fight. Same with Kevin Lee, or in the fight versus Kevin Lee. But Tony usually recovers well, then becomes an unstoppable and unrelenting nightmare for the opponent. And I think that he'll still be able to do that here versus Charles Oliveira, assuming that Tony is still able to comfortably get to the weight of 155 without it affecting performance. Now this fight is a 3-rounder and not a 5, so if Charles Oliveira has early success in the stand-up, Tony will have to turn things around sooner rather than later. He did so against Cowboy after Cowboy had a good first round. Tony doesn't have 2 rounds that he could give up here. He's going to have to make Oliveira feel the pressure pretty much by the second round. I think he understands the importance of that and will respond accordingly. But if Tony loses to Oliveira, we then really have to reassess where he stands going forward. Almost as dramatic a paradigm shift for him as there has been for Tyron Woodley, given his recent performances. Unless Tony gets, stopped via tricky submission. Sometimes things like that happen. I just think Ferguson's ground game is too well versed to get caught up in one of those, but it is possible. Still, I'm going with Tony Ferguson via decision. I mean, he might get the stoppage if he could really drown Oliveira with the pressure, and if he breaks him down, hell, it might be Tony submitting Oliveira like Ricardo Lamas and Showtime Pettis did back in, 2016. But I think it's more likely that Tony wins here via decision. But let me know your thoughts on this very interesting and kind of overlooked matchup. I know that it's late in the calendar year and the UFC isn't exactly finishing this year the strongest in an otherwise hugely groundbreaking, adaptive, and successful year for the UFC, given the COVID pandemic and all the issues that have come along with it. The UFC has kicked some serious ass this year. But yeah, let me know what you think about this fight. Specifically, what do you think a win here does for Tony? And what does a loss mean for Tony? Also, should the winner of this fight be in line for a title shot next? Or maybe 2 fights down, depending on how things stack up? We've got Dustin Poirier versus Conor McGregor Part 2 coming up. Justin Gaethje's obviously still lurking. It'd be interesting to match him up versus former Bellator champ and current UFC newcomer Michael Chandler. Current lightweight champ Khabib Nurmagomedov still doesn't sound interested in returning, at least not right now. He's retired. And if he doesn't come back, he'll have to soon relinquish his title. So there's still a lot that's up in the air in UFC's lightweight division. But please, leave your comments in the comments, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.